Welcome to the Deep Dive. If you are joining us, you know the score. We are here to bypass the noise, take the world's most dense and fascinating questions, and get you informed quickly and deeply.
And today we are really taking on what might be the ultimate question.
I think it is. We're looking at that intense, sometimes unnerving search for the soul and asking whether science can actually map transcendence.
It's an unavoidable topic.
Yeah.
And it really forces a clash between two deeply held worldviews. Our sources today, they pull from neurotheology, genetics, quantum physics, and some really radical personal anecdotes to explore this intersection.
And our challenge, our mission for this deep dive is to hold up that gold standard of scientific journalism. Demand evidence, take nothing on faith, and hold it right alongside the evidence of lived, transformative spiritual experience.
Exactly. We're going to unpack the scientific studies that try to, well, explain these numinous moments, or in some cases, explain them away. And we'll see if those explanations really capture the sheer magnitude of the experience.
This topic isn't just academic for me. It's deeply personal. I remember when I had to choose a side. I grew up in Christian Science, so I was taught to rely on spiritual discipline to address sickness. But then in 1984, I was hit by this terrible flu, and my mind, it didn't flash to prayer.
What did it flash to?
Tylenol. It flashed to Tylenol.
Right. And that decision, reaching for the physical solution over the spiritual principle, that's a profound metaphor, isn't it?
It is.
It's that moment of crossing the stream where the certainty of the material world just seems to overwhelm the effort that's required for spiritual faith.
Absolutely. And look, I still held fast to the idea of a creator, but I chose ease. I chose the pill. But then, years later, that feeling of certainty was just completely upended.
What happened?
I got lost. Completely terrifyingly alone, deep in the dense, dark hills of the Smoky Mountains. I was genuinely terrified, singing Psalm 139 at the top of my lungs to ward off bears. And it was in that dark soil of fear and confusion where a seed split open. I realized I had to stop settling for easy answers. I had to immerse myself in these unnerving, difficult questions about God and reality.
And that's exactly the journey we're replicating for you. We are starting with these radical, unbidden transformation stories, and then we'll move through the deep mind-body connection.
Then we're wrestling with genetics and brain mapping, diving into the controversial evidence of near-death experiences.
And finally, we'll look at how quantum physics might provide a radical new definition of God and reality itself.
So let's start with that first section, transformation, when God, as they say, breaks and enters.
We can start with a classic case of spontaneous transformation, the mystic next door.
Sophie Burnham. Our sources detail her life as a highly successful freelance writer in her mid-40s. And by all outward appearances, she had it all. The glittering Washington social life, a successful marriage.
But inside, she felt what she described as a deep, deep longing that couldn't be satisfied.
That internal vacuum, that longing, that seems to be a crucial precursor we see in so many mystical narratives. It suggests that, material success just isn't enough for some people.
For Sophie, this internal tension just broke wide open during a visit to Machu Picchu. She had this overwhelming, spontaneous revelation that lasted a full 45 minutes.
45 minutes is an eternity in an altered state like that.
It's unbelievable. She described a physical pressure at the back of her neck, and then this sound of hollow darkness, like a deep internal sound, almost like an oncoming train.
And then a voice.
A voice, yes, that said, "You belong to me." And instantly, everything turned to what she called a searing light.
The visual details she recounts are just. They defy normal human experience. She said she felt like she was witnessing the very beginnings and ends of the world.
But the image that truly sticks with you, the one that tries to capture the motion of the divine, is her seeing what she believed were electrons or atoms being swept along in the path of the hem of the garment of God.
Wow. It's like a glimpse of the physics underlying creation, but set into motion by this unseen force.
And the physiological and psychological impact was absolute. She felt incredible, radiating joy and saw light reflecting off everything. But when she returned to Washington...
The contrast must have been unbearable.
Completely. She had been sensitized to such a degree that normal social conversation felt like ashes in her mouth. She said she could hear people's hearts breaking underneath all their superficial, brittle social exchanges.
She was transformed, she said, at a cellular level, to the core of her being.
Right. And her husband's reaction really sums up that profound conflict. He said, "How can I compete with God?" She had encountered a reality that just dwarfed her former life.
And this connects us directly to William James, right? His 1902 work, The Varieties of Religious Experience, was really the first major scientific attempt to catalog and analyze these transformative moments. James took them seriously. He treated them as data.
He did. And yet, James's work was largely dismissed by the mid-20th century. Freud, for instance, just relegated the entire spiritual endeavor to pathology.
Right. He argued that this oceanic feeling,
The sense of unity with the universe.
yeah, that it was merely a regression, a memory of the infantile state of unity with the mother. He basically classified it as psychological immaturity.
So it's either pathology, sexual frustration, or just some random neurological misfire. The message was, spirituality is an escape from reality, not a perception of a deeper one.
But the research circle is closing again, thanks to the work of people like William Miller on what he called quantum change.
And these are sudden, permanent personality shifts, often eliminating alcoholism, addiction, or suicidal thoughts instantly, that just can't be explained by gradual psychological or therapeutic interventions.
The speed and the permanence, those are the key scientific puzzles here.
Mm-hmm.
Miller saw these shifts in people who went from total despair to treating life as an absolute gift.
He shared this one anecdote of an agnostic scientist, a severe alcoholic, who was forced to play a thought game in treatment. The therapist asked, if God existed, what would he look like?
And what did he say?
The man imagined a brilliant blue-white star, and when he mentally snatched it and touched it to his chest, the response was shockingly visceral.
A physical reaction.
Oh, absolutely. He experienced a physical ecstasy, describing it as infinitely better than the sexual climax. An overwhelming presence took him over, and when it left, he just wept, saying, "Thank you, my God."
And the scientific takeaway here is the evidence for non-gradual psychological transformation. From that one moment, the scientist instantly and permanently stopped drinking and quit his high-stress job.
Right. And this is where that skeptical explanation of placebo or self-talk starts to break down. Miller found this extraordinary universality.
So it didn't matter what their background was.
Not at all. Whether the subject was Presbyterian, Sufi, agnostic, or Jewish, they all describe the same other.
And how did they describe it?
Profoundly loving, profoundly accepting, and utterly beyond words. This eternal unanimity across all these different religious or non-religious frameworks. It strongly suggests a shared underlying reality is being accessed, even if the narratives they use to describe it are different.
So if the experience is consistent, it points to a common mechanism, or maybe a common destination.
That's the question. And if this profound spiritual transformation is real, we have to ask if that transformation, or even just simple belief, interacts with our material biology.
Which brings us to the mind-body connection, which for decades was just dismissed by Western medicine.
The idea that your thinking is your experience is, of course, the foundation of Christian Science. It defines prayer as a mental discipline that appeals to a spiritual law, almost like solving a mathematical equation correctly.
I look back at my mother, Mary Ann Bradley. She didn't seek medical attention immediately after an injury. She relied on prayer instead.
And what happened when she finally saw a doctor?
Months later, an X-ray confirmed the large bone in her right hand was broken. The doctor, looking at the film, was just astonished. He told her that in a normal case, they'd have to re-break the bone and reset it.
But in her case,
he said the bone was perfectly set and almost healed. He refused to perform the procedure because he felt it was unnecessary. She was just elated. For her, it was direct confirmation of God's law of order.
it's an extraordinary anecdote, but it seems impossible. And yet, modern science has started to back up this principle of mind over matter through the rigorous study of psychoneuroimmunology.
PNI.
PNI. It's the field that links psychothoughts and emotions to the brain and nerve signals, to immunology, our disease-fighting systems.
And the popular catalyst for PNI was Norman Cousins back in the 70s. He was diagnosed with this painful, crippling, and supposedly irreversible disease.
Right. Faced with a death sentence, Cousins dismissed his specialists, checked himself into a hotel, and decided to fight the disease with pure, sustained joy. He watched Candid Camera and Marx Brothers films.
And he found that 10 minutes of genuine belly laughter bought him 20 minutes of pain-free sleep.
His recovery was later published in the New England Journal of Medicine, which was huge. It provided empirical evidence that positive emotional states could actually impact biological processes.
And since Cousins, PNI research has deepened so much. We know now that thoughts and emotions affect us at the cellular level.
Absolutely. We know, for example, that chronic stress and depression aren't just mental states. They cause physical erosion. They're linked to heart attacks, suppressed immune systems, even measurable changes in our telomeres, which accelerates cellular aging.
But on the other hand, attitudes like hope and peace can significantly affect recovery from major illnesses.
Which brings us to Dr. Gail Ironson's really compelling research on HIV progression. She meticulously tracked objective biological measures like CD4 cell counts and viral load in HIV patients, while also measuring their psychological and spiritual state.
And what she found was startling, but also kind of predictable based on what we know from PNI.
Right. Depression, which is the most reliable negative psychological predictor across almost all illnesses, did in fact accelerate disease progression. CD4 cells disappeared twice as fast in the depressed patients.
But here's the major insight. Spirituality, which Ironson defined by the patient's sense of peace, belief in God, and tendency toward altruism, was the most powerful predictor of slower disease progression.
So it actually outweighed the negative immunological effects of depression.
That is huge. You could be depressed, but if you maintained a spiritual outlook, a sense of meaning, it acted as an immunological buffer.
And she even identified the mechanism. We know stress hormones like cortisol and norepinephrine accelerate HIV replication. Ironson's data show that the sense of peace and belief in God lowered cortisol levels, while altruism specifically lowered norepinephrine.
So in this context, spirituality is simply a superior stress reduction technique that fundamentally calms the biochemical storm that's fueling the disease.
Okay, so we can accept that. The connection between my mind and my body is accepted by mainstream science. But now we hit what our sources call the Maginot Line.
The strict dividing point that challenges the materialist paradigm.
Exactly. Intercessory prayer. What happens when I pray for someone else?
This is truly turbulent water. For intercessory prayer to work, some kind of non-material force would have to operate outside of current natural laws to infuse power into a prayer that acts on a distant individual. This is where science usually just closes the door.
And yet, there are studies, however controversial. The Bird study on cardiac patients suggested fewer complications for those receiving intercessory prayer. There have been other large studies showing replicated benefits for heart disease and advanced AIDS patients.
Let's just address the most bizarre and challenging piece of evidence. The Israeli study on retroactive prayer.
Right. This study involved intercessors praying in the year 2000 for nearly 300-400 patients who had suffered bloodstream infections in the early 1990s.
Wait, years after the infection occurred and the outcomes were already known.
Yes. Causality is running backward.
Isn't that the point where even the most open-minded scientist has to throw up their hands? Retroactive influence fundamentally violates classical physics.
It does. And most skeptics dismiss these findings as pure statistical flukes. They argue the randomization wasn't strict enough or the data was misinterpreted. However, the result was that the group that received retroactive prayer still showed lower mortality rates and shorter periods of fever than the group that wasn't prayed for.
So if we take that data at face value, even for a moment, the only way that effect can be explained is through a non-local, non-linear reality. The kind of reality that quantum physics suggests might exist, but which classical materialist science absolutely rejects.
Exactly. The Maginot Line remains absolute. Scientists will accept that your internal mental discipline affects your own body via PNI, but they fundamentally reject the idea that non-material thought, intention, or prayer can reach across space and time to affect someone else's body. That implies a consciousness or a field of influence outside of the brain's confines.
And that single point, the question of non-local influence, is where all the fierce intellectual combat takes place.
So we've established that the results of transcendence are often consistent and that belief affects biology. But what initiates the experience, it's often not peaceful meditation, but crisis.
If you want to find people who have been radically broken and remade, you look to the addict community.
Alcoholics Anonymous and similar programs are built entirely on spiritual principles, admitting complete powerlessness, surrendering to a higher power. It is arguably the most successful recovery program in history, but it relies entirely on a spiritual awakening for permanent sobriety.
Alicia's story illustrates this profound breaking point perfectly. She was a severe alcoholic and addict for most of her life. She'd relapse after pregnancies, relying on painkillers and cocaine. Her rock bottom came when her husband, also an addict, spent their family grocery money on drugs.
The humiliation was complete when they had to abandon a full cart of food at the Costco checkout. And later that night, lying on her cold kitchen sink, Alicia felt completely broken, just annihilated by despair.
But she described this annihilation as allowing an energy she called soul to get righted inside her.
And that moment of complete surrender resulted in permanent, instant sobriety. For her, hitting bottom wasn't a choice. It was a total breakdown of her ego's defenses.
Neurologists have tried to map this. Patrick McNamara hypothesizes that chronic stress and addiction severely deplete the brain's epinephrine system. Hitting bottom, that point of utter resignation and surrender, creates a vacuum.
A vacuum that allows the brain to unleash a surge of dopamine and endorphins, resulting in a physical euphoria. This euphoria, this feeling of being righted, is the biological reflection of conversion.
But again, we're back to that central tension. Does the biological explanation explain the euphoria away, or is the chemical surge simply the body's physical response to tuning into a genuinely encountered spiritual reality?
That is the philosophical friction. As researchers in this field often say, science can explain the biology of the spiritual experience, the dopamine, the endorphins, but it cannot explain the experience away if the subject genuinely feels they encountered an external, loving other.
Now let's look at the contrasting trigger. Not crisis, but the concerted long-term spiritual journey. The priming of the pump.
Right. Patrick McNamara also argued that spiritual experience is often a result of consistent, disciplined effort. We have the example of Don Eaton, a guitar player who had been on a spiritual pilgrimage for years.
He was on a long, financially discouraging drive, wondering if he should give up music and get a regular job, and then suddenly the discouragement just vanished.
The brown earth in front of him began to shimmer, and his entire world exploded into pixels of light. His hands started shaking so uncontrollably he had to pull over and record his experience live.
He described getting a sweeping experience of the Holy Spirit, a feeling of being full of electricity, and hearing a message that confirmed his inner understanding.
And like Sophie Burnham, he experienced the actual experience of unity with everything else. He used that classic mystical analogy being the drop of water in the ocean, but then realizing more profoundly that he felt the ocean in the drop.
And his friend later confirmed that Don had been intensely priming the pump for years through his spiritual practice. It suggests his brain was, in a sense, ready for the signal.
Which leads us to the genetic question. Is spirituality simply soft-wired, like temperament or intelligence?
Nancy Segal's twin studies suggested that genetics influences how the basic inclination toward a spiritual life, or how intensely one experiences it, while culture provides the content. Whether God is Jesus or God is nirvana.
This search for a biological foundation led to the highly controversial God-gene debate. Dean Hamer at the NIH claimed to have isolated a gene, VMAT2, which he suggested accounted for a tiny difference in self-transcendence scores.
This got massive media attention, but widespread scientific skepticism. Francis Collins, who headed the Human Genome Project and is himself an evangelical Christian, he publicly rebutted Hamer's claims.
Collins argued the study was methodologically weak. It relied solely on self-reported data, accounted for a minuscule difference, and crucially was not successfully replicated.
The core scientific objection is that spirituality is just too complex. It's an emergent property of the brain, interwoven with personality, morality, consciousness. You can't pin it down deterministically to a single gene.
Collins's philosophical position is interesting, though. He argues that if God intended to communicate with humans, it would be logical for him to create a biology, a neural wiring, that allows for that sort of relationship.
So the existence of a biology of religiosity is plausible, but finding one gene that dictates belief is scientifically pretty unlikely.
And other research, like that involving the DRD4 dopamine receptor, it only accounts for a very modest percentage of the difference in spirituality scores. So it's not a simple one-to-one relationship.
So if inclination is soft-wired, the next logical question is, where in the physical brain does transcendence happen? Scientists have long speculated about the connection between the temporal lobes and hyper-religiosity, the so-called God spot.
And this theory often links historical figures, Moses, St. Paul, Joan of Arc to temporal lobe epilepsy, or TLE. The idea is that neurological irritation or scarring in this specific area causes ecstatic, hyper-religious states.
We have to be careful with retrospective diagnosis, though. TLE is often accompanied by really debilitating symptoms, like random violent fits and significant short-term memory loss. That seems pretty inconsistent with the lives of highly functioning religious leaders who structured major civilizations.
That's a fair point, yet the link between the temporal lobe and radical personal shifts is undeniable. We see it in the case of Jordan Sinclair, a successful comedy writer.
After surgery to remove a benign tumor, the subsequent scarring caused TLE.
And his life became punctuated by seizures and these strange experiences, including jamais vu, the feeling that familiar surroundings, like his local shopping mall, suddenly looked utterly foreign, like a movie set facade.
But more profoundly, his entire internal value system shifted. He discovered Buddhism, and instantly he felt the light went on. For him, it was the absolute, undeniable truth.
Neurologists would categorize this cluster of changes: hyperreligiosity, altered sexuality, and sometimes hypergraphia, which is excessive writing as Geschwind syndrome. It's a pattern linked to TLE scarring.
So the physical change in his brain literally rewrote his deep personal belief structures. But for Jordan, it wasn't a syndrome. It was him finding ultimate reality.
The search for this neural mechanism really began with Wilder Penfield in the 1940s and 50s. He was a Canadian neurosurgeon who operated on conscious patients under local anesthesia, stimulating areas of the brain to map function before he would cut.
And when he stimulated the temporal lobes, he sometimes evoked memory fragments, intense emotion, and these mystical-like experiences. Patients would report hearing music, or voices, or feelings of intense, unbidden personal meaning.
This confirmed the temporal lobe was a critical entry point for transcendent content. Andrew Newberg took this pioneering work and brought it into the modern era, using brain scans, SPECT imaging, to study spiritual virtuosos in their deepest states of centering prayer and meditation.
He studied both Buddhist monks and Franciscan nuns, and their underlying theology was different, right? Buddhists focused on intense awareness of reality, while the nuns focused on union with a personal God.
Exactly. Yet their subjective descriptions of the peak experience were nearly identical. Absolute unitary being, where all sense of separation, self, time, and space just vanishes.
And the scans confirmed this physiological convergence. Their frontal lobes, the command center of the brain responsible for focus and intention, they lit up intensely.
Which makes sense, they are concentrating fiercely.
But crucially, their parietal lobes grew quiescent. This is the physiological key. The parietal lobe is what orients the self in three-dimensional space and creates the boundary between me and not me.
So if that boundary-making function shuts down, the brain is deprived of information about where the self ends and the world begins. And physiologically, the only conclusion the brain can draw is that the self has merged with the environment, which results in that subjective loss of self, time, and space.
This is theological dynamite. Physiologically, a mystical state is a mystical state, regardless of the narrative used to explain it. The neurobiology of union is universal.
But Newberg didn't stop there. He also studied the excited brains of Pentecostal women who were speaking in tongues, or glossolalia. A huge contrast to the quiet contemplation of the monks and nuns.
And in the women speaking in tongues, the scans showed decreased frontal lobe activity. This is consistent with the genuine loss of conscious control or will. It suggests the prayer language wasn't self-generated. This is that moment of surrender we talked about.
But unlike the contemplatives, their parietal lobe activity either increased or at least remained active.
And that physiological difference tells the whole story. The monks and nuns, with their quiescent parietal lobes, reported union. They became one with the divine. The Pentecostals, with their active parietal lobes, remained keenly aware of themselves as distinct from God. They were experiencing a relationship, a profound exchange with a separate deity.
It suggests the specific style of practice, not the underlying doctrine, determined the final neurological experience.
This naturally leads us to chemically induced mysticism, especially now that the government is relaxing its constraints on psychedelic research. If the brain can be chemically induced into these states, what does that say about the experience itself?
Well, Roland Griffiths at Johns Hopkins found that psilocybin, the active ingredient in magic mushrooms, can reliably mimic spontaneous mystical experiences. A significant portion of volunteers reported full-blown mystical experiences that they considered among the most meaningful moments of their lives.
As meaningful as giving birth or having a parent die. That's a profound statement.
It is. And the earlier, more controversial work by Stanislav Grof and Walter Richards with terminal cancer patients using LSD and DPT showed similar profound effects. The mystical experiences helped patients lose their deep fear of death and even reduce their physical pain significantly, often for weeks, far beyond any direct pharmacological effect.
They concluded that the patients were able to fundamentally change their concept of reality. Some even reported that the transition to the afterlife felt familiar, because they'd traveled there before during their psychedelic sessions.
Which all supports Aldous Huxley's famous theory that the brain acts as a reducing valve. Our brain evolved not to show us reality, but to filter out most of the overwhelming information that constitutes what he called mind at large, or ultimate reality.
So it only lets through what's required for survival. And psychedelic drugs temporarily open this valve, allowing access to dimensions of consciousness and interconnected information we normally screen out.
So we've thoroughly established that the brain is wired for transcendence. But the next, and maybe the biggest question is this: can consciousness exist independently of the brain?
And this is the central high-stakes question raised by near-death experiences, or NDEs.
NDEs follow a highly consistent 5-stage pattern that's reported globally. Stage 1 is peace, an overwhelming calm after the heart stops. 2 is the out-of-body experience, the OBE. 3 is the tunnel. 4 is seeing the brilliant light.
And 5 is entering the light for a profound life review or communion with other beings.
Edward's story perfectly captures this universality. Following an accident, he found himself sucked into a wormhole and placed in this beautiful, brilliant presence. He called the location the Library of Congress, where every question he silently formed was answered instantly.
He described seeing a majestic figure, God the Father, who looked like Charlton Heston as Moses, who patted his left thigh and simply said, "Come on."
And sitting in God's lap, Edward relived a complete 360-degree life review. He didn't just see his actions. He felt, with incredible fidelity, the emotional ripple effects his actions had on others, even a moment where he teased a girl with a lisp in elementary school.
The profound moral imperative of that life review led him to completely jettison his business career to become a minister and a yoga teacher. The transformation was total.
But the critical piece of scientific evidence challenging the materialist model lies in veridical perception during the OBE.
Veridical meaning they see things that are actually happening.
Exactly. If consciousness is solely a product of brain function, then when the brain shuts down, consciousness must cease. Veridical OBEs, where a person reports accurate, new information about the physical world while clinically dead, suggest otherwise.
And the most famous case is Pam Reynolds. She underwent a complex standstill surgery. To perform the procedure, her body temperature was lowered to 60 degrees, her blood was drained, and critically, her brainstem monitor was flatlined.
So by all scientific measures, her brain was essentially offline, incapable of complex information processing.
Yet while clinically dead, Pam reported observations of the surgery that she could not have physically perceived. She distinctly heard the metallic sound of the Midas Rex saw used to cut bone, describing it specifically as a natural D.
And she heard the doctors discussing the small size of her femoral vein. She even witnessed the electric paddle thing being applied at the very end of the procedure, a detail the surgeon initially denied but later had to confirm.
This brings us to the ultimate point of friction. Scientific skeptics, like the anesthesiologist Gerald Worley, argue fiercely that consciousness only exists as a product of the brain. He attributes NDEs to the operatic demise of a dying brain.
So adrenaline dilating the pupils for the light generic brain activity, firing off memories, that sort of thing.
Exactly. But let's critically examine Worley's argument against Pam Reynolds. He tried to explain her accurate description of the saw by suggesting it sounded like a dental drill, a common memory.
But what about hearing the doctors? She had ear molds in that were emitting 90 decibel clicks to monitor her brainstem.
Right. And when pressed on that, he scoffed, insisting the moles were rubbish, and she must have heard them anyway. But the data is the data. The brainstem monitor was flatlined.
His insistence that she must have heard them, despite the physical evidence, it reveals an intellectual circularity. He starts with the assumption consciousness is solely a product of the brain, and then forces the data to conform to that assumption.
He dismisses verifiable details as auditory misinterpretation or just lucky guesses.
And this friction is the heart of our deep dive. You're forced to choose between believing in a consciousness that transcends the brain, or throwing out verifiable, documented evidence to maintain a materialist philosophical framework.
The search continues for NDE fingerprints. Mario Beauregard studied NDE subjects, like Jorge Medina, asking them to recreate their experience in an fMRI scanner to see if it left a neurological mark. He wondered if it would be similar to the thousands of hours of training he'd studied in Carmelite nuns.
Beauregard hypothesized that the NDE might instantly achieve the kind of spiritual state that usually requires intensive long-term training.
So it's like a jump start.
A jump start to spirituality. Gilles, for instance, had a near-death experience when he was medically frail, yet he could revisit that profound light 30 years later, describing the sound that came into him as the breath of the universe. If the brain is physically altered or rewired by this instantaneous, high-intensity experience, achieving in minutes what takes years of contemplative practice, it suggests a profound and non-ordinary reality has been accessed, one powerful enough to instantly change the neural structure.
Which brings us to our final section. Given the difficulty of measuring the traditional anthropomorphic deity, science has been busy redefining God based on empirical evidence and mathematical precision. This is God 1.0.
Einstein spoke of a superior mind. Stephen Hawking pondered what breathes fire into the equations. Quantum physicist Paul Dirac called God a mathematician of very high order.
This new deity is characterized by infinite information, omnipresence, and the stunning, impossible precision of the universal laws that allow life to exist in the first place.
And this redefinition finds its deepest modern roots in quantum physics, specifically the concepts of entanglement and non-local consciousness.
Larry Dossey defined non-local consciousness based on quantum properties. If consciousness is infinite in space, it's omnipresent. If it's infinite in time, it's eternal.
And Dossey concluded that this property of consciousness is theological dynamite because it provides a mechanism to connect everything, which is the very definition of God.
Dean Radin, a scientist at the Institute of Noetic Sciences, took this principle even further with his hypothesis of entangled minds. He argues that reality isn't separate chunks of matter floating in space, but a tightly woven, holistic, and entangled fabric.
He uses the analogy of Jell-O.
The Jell-O analogy is crucial. If you poke one corner of the green gelatin, the stuff on the other side jiggles instantaneously. Entanglement means information about an event affecting one particle or one twin can instantaneously affect another, no matter the distance.
This defies classical physics, which demands information cannot travel faster than the speed of light.
So if human consciousness is entangled, then we are constantly bathed in an overwhelming cacophony of universal information. This supports Huxley's reducing valve metaphor again. We've evolved to filter out almost all of this mind at large, only allowing access to the small amount of information necessary for immediate physical survival.
But if we are constantly filtering, sometimes an important event or a person momentarily breaks through that veil, like hearing your name whispered clearly in a crowded, noisy cocktail party.
And Radin rigorously tested this interconnectedness in his love study. The methodology here was key. A sender was placed in one room, and a receiver was isolated in an electromagnetically sealed, shielded room hundreds of feet away. The sender's task was just to send loving, focused intentions toward the receiver.
And they found a small but highly significant effect. The receiver's physiology, specifically their sweat glands and blood flow, mimicked the sender's emotional state, both arousal and then relaxation, within milliseconds.
Milliseconds. That timing is the key scientific breakthrough here. The response was too rapid to be explained by conventional means, like radio waves or electromagnetic signals, which were shielded anyway.
It suggests a non-classical connection between minds, consistent with the idea that we exist within a holistic, entangled medium where information is shared non-locally.
In this scientific framework, it provided the language for me to understand my own small moment of crisis involving lost material. I lost a set of crucial research minidiscs in the mail. Nearly a year of interviews had just vanished.
So what did you do?
I enlisted every conventional resource, the U.S. Postal Service investigative arm, dozens of employees, managers, but I also called a Christian Science practitioner.
And what was the spiritual intervention?
The practitioner's prayer focused intensely on God's law of order and intelligence. It was about affirming that nothing that belongs to you can be separated from you, just an absolute belief in the inherent order of the universe.
And what happened?
Weeks later, the discs were found, not by the conventional search, but by an unexplained shift. They were in the bottom of a large, random orange container at a major distribution center.
And Radin's interpretation of this event was highly insightful. He viewed the intensive conventional search, the army of people out there, combined with the highly focused spiritual intention as creating a powerful network of attention.
And this network momentarily shined a little bit brighter on the object. In a holistic, entangled medium, he concluded, nothing can truly be lost. It's just filtered out.
Which brings us back, full circle, to William James's essential philosophical choice. He stated that both the materialist worldview and the spiritualist worldview can explain the phenomena we have discussed, from the placebo effect to the emotional shift of addiction recovery.
But the divergence lies in the future. Materialism, as James noted, predicts the ultimate collapse, decay, and annihilation of all meaning when the universe cools down and dies. Spiritualism, conversely, affirms internal moral order and allows for what he called the letting loose of hope.
The choice isn't based on the current data, but on which future you choose to invest in.
So we began this deep dive with spontaneous, life-altering transformations like Sophie Burnham's. We moved through the biochemistry of stress and belief with Dr. Ironson. We wrestled with the genetic wiring of inclination, and we mapped transcendence in the temporal and parietal lobes.
And we've seen that the human system is profoundly wired for transcendence, regardless of whether that wiring is activated by deep crisis, sustained spiritual training, genetics, or even chemical means like psilocybin. The biological machinery is there.
But where does this leave faith? I mean, science can explain the biology of a spiritual experience, the parietal lobe quieting down or the release of dopamine, but it cannot determine the veracity of the claim that you met God or an other or experienced ultimate reality.
Right. Faith, the narrative overlay, whether it is Christian, Buddhist, or Sufi, is the story humans use to navigate and make sense of that unseen shared reality encountered during these experiences. And since the physiological experience of union is so often unitary, it strongly suggests that no single religion may have an exclusive franchise on God or truth.
Which leaves us with a final provocative thought. If the brain is a radio, what are we tuning out? Terence Ayala, a federal prosecutor with TLE, felt an ontological reality he called his sensed presence, or Bob, vanished completely when doctors changed his medication.
He reflected that we pay musicians to hear new harmonies and artists to see new images and new colors. Yet when someone's brain naturally tunes into these alternate unified realities, we are very quick to classify it as mental illness and medicate it away in our quest for material conformity.
So if the brain is indeed a receiver, one capable of accessing signals from a non-local reality, the critical question is this: what dimensions of connection or what parts of mind at large are we choosing to tune out when we medicate away difference?
That's a compelling thought to mull. As you decide which worldview, the material or the spiritual best, explains the deepest realities you experience every day.